Hello, I'm Connor Bomarsich, and today I will be discussing Antigua and Barbuda. First, I will discuss the history of Antigua and Barbuda. The first settlement dates to 2400 BC. They were known as the Saboni people, sorry if I mispronounced that, which is an Arawak word for stone people due to their ability to craft stone tools and shell tools that have been found on the island. Following the Saboni was the Arawaks, who were an agricultural-based people who were peaceful and driven out by the Carib people, who were an aggressive group who ranged all over the Caribbean. Following that was the first European contact by Christopher Columbus in 1493. He named the island after the Santa Maria Antigua, the miracle working saint of Seville. There was not a successful European settlement until 1632 by a group of Englishmen who turned the island into a sugar-producing powerhouse, Antigua and Barbuda. In 1834, Britain abolished slavery, thus reducing the sugar industry and opened the door for freedom. The British abolishing slavery was huge to their independence movement, as now they were not slaves and didn't work for them and can now have their own minds and work towards their independence. Next, I will discuss the economics of Antigua and Barbuda. Their economy was built in agriculture all throughout their history. They grew tobacco, indigo, and cotton, and then switched over to sugar plantations where the slaves were being imported and turned to a slave system. But as sugar began to wane, thanks to the emancipation, the agriculture industry began to get reduced. Next is tourism, which is huge today. It is the biggest right now and accounts for more than half of Antigua and Barbuda's GDP. And there's also some fishing found in Barbuda. They're mainly known for their fish and lobster. And there's also some financial services found on the islands with attractive offshore junctions, but they have to be careful of money laundering as there has been scandals in the past. Next, I'll discuss the politics. In 1674, Christopher Cordington established the first large plantation in Antigua, with Barbuda being used to raise more plantations. In 1807, the abolition of the slave trade in British territories was huge. It prompted Cordington to establish big slave farms in Barbuda, where children were bred to supply the region's unpaid labor force, which is terrible to hear. In 1871, Antigua and Barbuda joined the Federated Leeward Islands Colony, which started a demand for self-independence. And in 1967, the status of associated statehood with Britain was achieved, meaning they have their own self-government, while Britain is responsible for their defense and other external matters. And then finally, on November 1st, 1981, they were granted full independence, although it remains part of the Commonwealth of Nations and constitutional monarchy. For the creative production, I'll be discussing Carnival, which is a 10-day festival of colorful costumes, beauty pageants, talent shows, and good music that celebrates their emancipation. Calypso competitions have been a highlight of Carnival. It is the oldest and has its roots in slavery. It is an improvised form that depends largely upon a skilled soloist who weaves the sounds of many cultures into a lyrical whole. And for part B, I will be discussing using Stuart Hall's identity and diaspora. So two aspects of identity, being and becoming. Being is the unity, being, and grounding of past, whereas becoming is uniqueness, production, transformation, and Stuart Hall talks about how identity is an ongoing process. Hall emphasizes that culture identity is a matter of becoming as well as being that identifies concern not only in the ways in which we are positioned, but also position ourselves within historic narratives. In other words, this second sense of cultural identity holds that identity is not a fixed or stable, but constantly in flux, changing and taking shape as history changes and takes shape. So basically, for Antigua and Barbuda, it relates to them 100%, as they have to learn that their identity used to be in Africa, that was taken from them, and they were brought to the Caribbean. but they have to know that their past doesn't identify them. They have their whole lives to become and transform their identities into who they are today. And the second form is diaspora, and that's central to identity and transformation. Under the definition, cultural identities are reflective of a common history and experience, which provide groups with stable, unchanging, and continuous frames of reference and meaning. In the case of the Caribbean diaspora, shared experiences and meaning rise above trivial individual differences, creating a Caribbean essence. And this relates to Antigua and Barbuda again, as their history was in Africa, but now they have to adapt and identify themselves by using their African heritage, but also using their new Caribbean heritage and transforming into a new identity. The next story I will talk about is Julia de Burgos. So in this poem, she describes how Afro-Caribs looked and felt, which relates to Antigua and Barbuda, as over 90% of the population is of African descent. She mentions how they felt and how they looked, and how they felt sad by how they looked. And in the poem, they also mention how the grandfather was a slave. And the poem further relates, as it mentions how the grandfather was a slave. The sadness involved knowing he was a slave and what he had to go through can be related to the native people, again, as over 90% are of African descent. For part C is my process. My process was that I honestly had no real knowledge of the country of Antigua and Barbuda, other than hearing maybe one friend vacation there once before. So for part A, I believe the best way to learn about Antigua and Barbuda was to learn about their history, economy, creative production, and politics. To me, knowing their history of how they became to be, how their economy works, what they celebrate and how they have some enjoyment, and overall their political structure are key to knowing how a country and people work. And for part B/D, my process was that after I started researching for part A and learned more about the history, the culture, the people, I realized which two novels from class would identify with them, being Stuart Hall and Julia de Burgos' pieces that I learned would relate to the Antigua and Barbuda people. And for part D, Beyond the Classroom, the two texts by Julia de Burgos and Stuart Hall discuss the significance of cultural identity and history of slavery in the area. Reading and incorporating the in-class text will benefit me outside the classroom for many reasons. Stuart Hall's essay gives me an understanding of how one identifies himself, which is important to know, especially in today's world. It is important for people of the world to feel prideful about your identity and how to identify oneself properly. I can apply this to all different ethnic backgrounds to help me understand people from all over the world, especially the Caribbean and their history. And also I can help expand this message and tell other people about Stuart Hall's story so that maybe they can get a better understanding of their own identity. And I believe it is important for everyone to learn how to identify oneself culturally, especially the Caribbean people who have such a long, sad history of slavery. And Julia de Burgos' story further deepens my knowledge of the history of Caribbean slaves and how a large amount of the Caribbean population is of African descent, and how that affected them not only mentally, but culturally, and just how to identify themselves. So overall, I believe these texts would go ways into the world today, because with the ever-changing world, it is important for everyone to have their own identity and not be persecuted for having that identity. And then here is my works cited, and that will finish the presentation. Thank you.